In the summer of 1876, in a remote cabin nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a child was born who would never draw a single breath of free air. Before his umbilical cord was even severed, before his mother could hold him against her chest, medical hands had already claimed him as property of science. This is the story of Samuel Hartwell, though that name appears nowhere in official records. The doctors who took him called him only Specimen H. 47. The Hartwell family had lived in the hollers of Pocahontas County for over a century, their bloodline as twisted and tangled as the mountain roads that led to their isolated homestead. What began as necessity in the harsh wilderness, where finding a spouse meant looking no further than your own kin, had become a generational curse written in flesh and bone. By 1876, the family tree had collapsed in on itself so completely that Samuel's parents, Martha and Josiah Hartwell, shared not just a surname, but the same great-grandmother, the same grandfather, and a genetic legacy that would horrify even the most hardened medical professionals of their time. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood first learned of the Hartwell family through local folklore, whispered tales of the mountain folk who bred like livestock. As chief physician at the newly established Charleston Medical Institute, Blackwood had made his reputation studying what he termed the degenerative effects of consanguineous unions on the human form. To him, the Hartwells represented the perfect laboratory. The isolated Appalachian communities of the 1870s existed in a world apart from civilized society. Here, families had intermarried for generations out of necessity, geography, and tradition. The Hartwells were perhaps the most extreme example. A family where cousins married cousins, where uncles wed nieces, where the same blood ran through every vein in increasingly concentrated doses. Martha Hartwell had already given birth to 7 children, though only 3 survived past infancy. Those who lived bore the unmistakable marks of their corrupted bloodline: twisted spines, club feet, vacant stares that suggested minds as malformed as their bodies. The mountain community had learned to look away, to speak of the Hartwells only in hushed tones, if at all. But Dr. Blackwood was not content to merely observe from a distance. In the spring of 1876, Dr. Blackwood and his associate, Dr. Edmund Crane, established what they called a rural medical outreach program in Pocahontas County. They arrived with legitimate credentials, proper documentation, and promises of free medical care for the mountain families who had never seen a doctor in their lives. The reality was far more sinister. Blackwood had spent months studying genealogical records, tracing family lines, mapping the intricate web of intermarriage that characterized these isolated communities. He identified the Hartwells as the most promising subjects for his research, a living experiment in human degeneration that had been running for over 100 years. When Martha Hartwell entered her 8th pregnancy in early 1876, Dr. Blackwood knew this child would be special. Based on his calculations, the infant would represent the most concentrated example of inbreeding he had ever encountered. A child whose family tree was less a tree than a telephone pole. The cabin where Samuel was born sat at the end of a dirt path that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles. The nearest neighbor lived a full day's walk away. It was the perfect location for what Blackwood had planned. On the night of August 15, 1876, Martha Hartwell went into labor. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Crane arrived as if by coincidence, claiming they had been making their rounds when they noticed the family's distress. Josiah Hartwell, a man whose own features bore the telltale signs of generational inbreeding, eyes set too close together, a severely underdeveloped jaw, hands with fused fingers, welcomed the doctors with pathetic gratitude. What happened in that cabin over the next 18 hours would remain hidden for nearly a century. According to Dr. Blackwood's private journals, discovered in 1967 during the demolition of the Charleston Medical Institute, Martha Hartwell's labor was extraordinarily difficult, complicated by severe pelvic deformities consistent with subject's genetic background. The child, when he finally emerged, was what Blackwood described as a perfect specimen of genetic collapse. Samuel Hartwell was born with severe microcephaly, his skull barely larger than an orange. His spine curved at impossible angles, creating a twisted form that seemed to fold in on itself. Most disturbing of all, his eyes, pale blue like his father's, his mother's, his grandfather's, and his great-grandfather's before him, showed signs of severe developmental abnormalities. But Samuel Hartwell was alive. His heart beat. His lungs drew air. His tiny malformed fingers grasped nothing. Dr. Blackwood made his decision in those first moments after birth. This child, he wrote in his journal, was too valuable to science to be left to die in ignorance and squalor. Within hours of Samuel's birth, while Martha lay unconscious from blood loss and Josiah sat in stunned silence, the doctors acted.
They told the family that the child had been stillborn. They showed Josiah a carefully wrapped bundle, actually containing a deceased infant they had brought from Charleston, and spoke in hushed, professional tones about God's mercy and nature's way. They offered to handle the burial, sparing the grieving parents the additional trauma. Josiah Hartwell, broken by generations of poverty and isolation, barely literate and utterly trusting of these educated men who had shown his family such kindness, agreed. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Crane left the Hartwell cabin before dawn, carrying with them a living child who would never know his real name, never see his mountain home again, never experience a single moment of freedom. Samuel, now designated as Specimen H47, was transported to a specially constructed facility beneath the Charleston Medical Institute. Here, Dr. Blackwood had created what he called his developmental observation laboratory, a series of chambers designed to house and study the most extreme examples of human genetic abnormality he could acquire. Samuel was not alone in those underground rooms. Over the course of 2 years, Dr. Blackwood had collected 17 other specimens, children taken from isolated mountain families, each representing different degrees of inbreeding and genetic damage. They ranged in age from newborn to 12 years old. All had been declared dead to their families. All lived in the darkness beneath Charleston, studied like laboratory rats. Dr. Blackwood's journals reveal the extent of his experiments. He subjected these children to daily measurements, blood draws, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. He documented every aspect of their development, their deterioration, their suffering. He photographed them from every angle, measured their skulls with calipers, tested their limited cognitive abilities with cruel precision. Samuel, as the most severely affected, received special attention. Dr. Blackwood's notes describe him as remarkably resilient despite extensive malformations, and possessing an almost supernatural tenacity for life. The child survived procedures that killed others. He endured pain that would have broken stronger specimens. But Samuel Hartwell, Specimen H47, never learned to speak, never learned to walk, never knew that somewhere in the mountains a woman named Martha still wept for the son she believed was buried in unnamed ground. The laboratory operated in complete secrecy for 3 years. Dr. Blackwood published papers in medical journals across the country, establishing himself as a leading authority on genetic degeneration. He presented his findings at conferences, his reputation growing with each horrifying revelation about the effects of inbreeding on human development. His colleagues never asked where he obtained his specimens. They never questioned how he managed to study living examples of such extreme genetic damage. The scientific community, hungry for knowledge and blind to ethics, celebrated his work as groundbreaking research that would help prevent such genetic tragedies in the future. The truth began to unravel in 1879 when Dr. Edmund Crane, racked with guilt and descending into alcoholism, confessed to a local minister. The minister, Father Thomas McKenna, initially dismissed Crane's story as the ravings of a drunk, but when Crane produced a key to the laboratory and described in precise detail the horrors hidden beneath the Medical Institute, Father McKenna was forced to confront an almost unimaginable reality. On November 12, 1879, Father McKenna and 2 trusted members of his congregation entered the Charleston Medical Institute after hours and made their way to the basement laboratory. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The laboratory contained 14 living children. 4 had died during Dr. Blackwood's experiments, kept in conditions that would have shamed a slaughterhouse. They lived in small, windowless cells, fed just enough to survive, subjected to constant medical torture masquerading as scientific research. Many bore surgical scars. All showed signs of severe neglect and abuse. Samuel Hartwell, now 3 years old, was the smallest of the survivors. Father McKenna's description of the child, preserved in a letter to the Bishop of Charleston, paints a heartbreaking picture. The boy is barely larger than an infant, his body so twisted and small that he seems more like a broken doll than a living creature. Yet his eyes, pale blue and ancient with suffering, seem to hold an awareness that breaks the heart to witness. Father McKenna immediately contacted local authorities, but the wheels of justice moved slowly in 1879, especially when the accused was a respected member of the medical establishment. Dr. Blackwood, alerted to the discovery by allies within the police department, fled Charleston with Dr. Crane and several boxes of research materials. They were never captured, never brought to trial, never held accountable for their crimes. The surviving children presented authorities with an almost impossible problem. Most could not be identified. Dr. Blackwood had destroyed records connecting them to their original families. Some had been taken so young they retained no memory of their lives before the laboratory. Others were so severely damaged physically and mentally that they required constant medical care.
Samuel Hartwell was among those who could not be returned to their families. even if authorities had been able to identify him, and they never were. His condition was too severe for him to survive outside of institutional care. He was transferred to the West Virginia State Hospital for the Insane, where he spent the remainder of his short life. Records from the state hospital describe Samuel as patient 1847, another number, another lost identity. He never grew larger than a typical one-year-old child. He never spoke, never walked, never showed signs of cognitive development beyond the most basic responses. Nurses who cared for him noted that he seemed to find comfort in music, turning his oversized head toward the sound whenever someone sang or hummed. Samuel Hartwell, Specimen H47, patient 1847, died on March 23, 1884, at the age of 7. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure secondary to spinal deformities. He was buried in the hospital's unmarked cemetery, his grave identified only by a number carved into a wooden post. His parents, Martha and Josiah Hartwell, never learned that their son had lived. They died believing he had been stillborn, never knowing that for 7 years he had existed in a world of medical horror beyond their worst nightmares. The secret died with Father McKenna in 1923, locked away in church records that wouldn't see daylight for another 40 years. The Charleston Medical Institute closed its doors in 1881, officially due to financial difficulties. The building was sold and converted into apartments, the basement laboratory sealed and forgotten. It wasn't until urban renewal projects in the 1960s that necessitated the building's demolition that workers discovered the hidden chambers and Dr. Blackwood's journals. The journals revealed the full scope of the horror: 17 children stolen from their families, subjected to years of medical torture, their suffering documented with clinical precision. The discovery sparked a federal investigation, congressional hearings, and new laws governing medical research. But for Samuel Hartwell and the others who had suffered in those underground rooms, justice came far too late. Today, a small memorial park occupies the site where the Charleston Medical Institute once stood. A bronze plaque mentions the medical research tragedy of the 1870s, but provides no details about the specific horrors that occurred here. Most visitors walk past without stopping, unaware that they're standing above ground once soaked with the tears of stolen children. The Hartwell family bloodline ended in the mountains of West Virginia sometime in the early 1900s. The last known member of the family, Samuel's sister, Ruth, herself severely disabled by the genetic legacy of generations of inbreeding, died unmarried and childless in 1907. The family cabin collapsed decades ago, reclaimed by the forest that once hid their isolation. But the questions raised by Samuel Hartwell's story persist. How many other children disappeared into the darkness of unregulated medical research during the 19th century? How many families were told their babies had died, when in reality they had been taken to feed the appetites of science? How many Specimen H47s suffered and died in basement laboratories across America, their existence known only to the doctors who treated them as property rather than human beings? The medical community of the 1870s operated with virtually no oversight, no ethical guidelines, no legal constraints on what could be done in the name of scientific progress. Children like Samuel Hartwell, born into families too isolated, too poor, too powerless to protect them, became raw material for experiments that would be considered war crimes today. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood and Dr. Edmund Crane disappeared into history, their ultimate fate unknown. Some records suggest they fled to South America, where they continued their research beyond the reach of American law.
Others claim they changed their identities and established new practices in the American West, where questions about credentials were seldom asked and documentation rarely required. What we do know is that their work, built on the stolen lives of children like Samuel Hartwell, contributed to early understanding of genetics and heredity. Medical textbooks from the late 19th century cite their research, their photographs, their detailed observations. The knowledge gained from Samuel's suffering advanced science, but at a cost that defies calculation. The story of America's most inbred child reminds us that progress built on cruelty is not progress at all, that knowledge gained through suffering carries a stain that can never be washed clean, that the most vulnerable among us, the isolated, the different, the powerless, have always been at risk of becoming stepping stones for those who justify any horror in the name of advancement. Samuel Hartwell lived for 7 years without ever knowing kindness, without ever experiencing love, without ever being seen as anything more than a specimen to be studied and documented. He died as he had lived, alone, unnamed, his humanity denied by those who should have protected him. His story, hidden for nearly a century, stands as a testament to the darkest chapters of American medical history. It reminds us that beneath the veneer of scientific progress lies a foundation built on bones, watered with tears, and sanctified by the suffering of those who had no voice to cry out against the darkness. What state are you watching from tonight? And as you reflect on Samuel's story, ask yourself, what other secrets might still be buried beneath the institutions we trust with our lives? What other Specimen H 47s might have suffered in silence, their stories lost to time and shame? The mountain winds still blow through the hollows of West Virginia, carrying with them the whispers of the forgotten. Samuel Hartwell's voice was never heard in life, but perhaps in the telling of his story, he can finally speak his truth to a world that failed to protect him when protection mattered most. Some horrors are too great to forgive, too dark to forget. The story of Specimen H 47 is one of them. In remembering Samuel Hartwell, we honor not just his memory, but our obligation to ensure that such darkness never falls across the innocent again.